Good afternoon and welcome back. Again, my name is Dale Brubaker, a Canadian by birth. I have lived in the United States for close to 52 years now. I became a naturalized U.S. citizen in Atlanta, Georgia on September 17, 1987, the 200-year anniversary of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. To mark the occasion, a most symbolic and special ceremony was planned, where 50 of us, representing 50 different countries, were sworn in as new citizens. I would have the honor of representing Canada. As I mentioned in my presentation this morning, I became interested in my family ancestry back in 2014. Like a lot of people at that time, I was interested in tracing and creating my family tree from my earliest known ancestor to present day. My wife and I have one daughter and two sons, from whom the three of them have one son each, all born within 13 months, the youngest having just celebrated his first birthday. Three grandsons to carry on the Brubaker name. As a means of clarification, my daughter's husband is a Brubaker as well, remarkably choosing to take our family name at their marriage. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention I have a precious 4-year-old granddaughter as well. I am of the D line, this in keeping with how families and individuals are designated by capital letters and numbers as established in the popular 1951 genealogy book by Ferris Brubaker Gibble. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to please excuse my initial focus and attention given to the D line. As I stated earlier, I feel fortunate to have had family historians during my lifetime who have updated my family line, picking up where Gibble's book leaves off. I find it amazing to be able to trace and chart our heritage back to when our ancestor, Abraham Brubaker, arrived and settled in America. Identified as D2 of the family line, Abraham arrived in Philadelphia on the ship, the St. Andrew, on September 9th, 1749. The story is told is that Abraham's older cousin, John, identified as A2, whose father was Hans Brubaker, one of our first ancestors to come to Pennsylvania, left America to return to Germany in search for a wife. Abraham, at the age of 18, living with his family in what is now the Palatinate region of Germany, was encouraged to accompany John and Maria Newcomer on their voyage back to America. Here is a section of the ship's manifest for the St. Andrew that identifies Abraham and John Brubaker as passengers. It is interesting to note that women, no matter what age, as well as boys under the age of 18, were not recorded and included on the passenger list. Also take note of the spelling of their names. The misspelling of names is a common occurrence and observation to those of us who conduct genealogy research. Errors often will appear in census reports, property deeds, church records, immigration documents, etc. Here's a wonderful oil painting titled Landing of the Schwensfelders from the St. Andrew, arriving to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1734 by the artist Adolphe Ganache. It is easy to imagine and visualize Abraham disembarking from the same ship, the St. Andrew, arriving at the same destination only 15 years later. I often enjoy opportunities to be transported back in time, whether it be through reading a novel, listening to music, viewing art and architecture, etc., or through travel to historic and scenic places around the world. It is my hope that there will be moments during this presentation that will encourage you to be transported back in time as well. During this presentation, I will highlight some of my wife and my travels in Switzerland, France, and Germany, mostly as they pertain to our ancestral story. For sake of time, I will not be providing much commentary as we journey to and view photographs taken from these travel destinations, but only wish for you to sit back, be transported, and enjoy. On this aerial view, I have circled locations around Lake Zurich, where we will travel to and learn about this afternoon. One of which we journeyed to this morning on the east side of Lake Zurich, directly inland from the town of Ehrenbach. Notice the triangle symbol where the passer dispute occurred, establishing the location of our namesake bridge and brook, the Brubach. Take note of the destinations as they are highlighted in blue, starting in the area around Spitzen at the lower left, from where we will travel to. To Alsace, France, and visit the town of Rimauville, the neighboring village of Mackenheim. And then we will continue on to Ebersheim, located in the Palatinate region of southwest Germany. And ultimately go down a section of the Rhine River from Bacharach to Koblenz. While pursuing research into our ancestry, I discovered there were a lot of missing puzzle pieces to fill in, the connecting of dots to perform. The more I delved into my family line, the more I became fascinated and intrigued about our shared ancestral roots, expanding and venturing beyond the narrower path I had been taking. Again, by piggybacking on the old-fashioned legwork conducted by others, I feel I have been able to gather and study their research from a unique perspective to determine where there is agreement, question some of their findings, and arrive at connections and discoveries. Now that the charting of my ancestral line is almost complete, I would be interested in going back to our ancestral story and put it all into historical context. To learn more about the wars, conflicts, plagues, discoveries, etc., that were happening at that moment in time. Please understand that my knowledge of history as it pertains to our ancestral story is spotty and minimal at the present time. I'd like to proceed with this presentation by delving into our ancestral lineage. Knowing that genealogy may not be of interest to some of you, I will try to minimize the amount of content as best as I can, purposely avoiding a lot of names and dates. This simple chart is based on the research conducted independently by Jane Evans Best and Richard Warren Davis. At the top of our family tree is thought to be Hans Brubacher, born around 1500 in Zumikon, on the east side of Lake Zurich. Hans was most notable for being one of the first to be baptized as an adult at nearby Zolikon, the center of the oldest Anabaptist community in Zurich. Here are some views of the historic site at 25 Gstaadtstrasse in Zolikon, where in 1525, Hans is thought to have been baptized by the Anabaptist leaders Felix Manz and Joris Blaurock. Next in line, we have Brubacher, born about 1542. The name Rutschli is thought to be a mistranslation of the name Rudolph, the Swiss version of the German name Rudolph. Rutschli lived on the west side of Lake Zurich in Wädenswil. He and his wife, Anna Wies, had 3 children, Peter, Uli, and Anneli. I have been told that the first names ending with an Li or Ly, pronounced Lee, often occurs during childhood. Uli and Anneli, informal names of endearment, used for Ulrich and Anna. Peter is a variation of the name Peter. I will be using Peter going forward. Most all of us here, it is presumed, are a continuation of Peter's line. However, in a particular note, the family line of our speaker from last evening, Dale Brubaker, follows the ancestral line of Uli. Next in line on the chart, we have Peter Brubacher, born in 1566, and his wife, Margrethe Nägeli. They also would have a son named Peter. It is this Peter Brubacher who we will get to know and spend more time with. Before we proceed, I think it interesting to know that to this day, there continues to be a strong presence of Brubakers around Lake Zurich in particular. During my presentation this morning, we learned that our earliest known ancestors were Heinrich Brubacher and his sister. Heinrich, or perhaps his father, was given and would adopt the name Brubacher because of their close proximity to the noteworthy bridge and brook called Brubacher. The name Brubacher, mainly for ease of pronunciation, evolved and became Brubacher. It goes by 2 different spellings today, but as I understand, pronounced the same way. I'm sure the Brubachers who have remained in Switzerland must have their own ancestral story to tell. However, it is the Anabaptist Brubachers forced to leave Switzerland who would become part of our ancestral story. I'm not sure when the variations of our surname began to change over time, but it seems possible, and pure conjecture on my part, that our name further evolved to become Brubaker with a CH, perhaps when the Brubakers relocated to Germany before immigrating to America. Today, the Brubaker name in North America has 3 variations, and as far as I understand, pronounced pretty much the same way as Brubaker. Now getting back to our ancestor, Peter. Peter Brubacher was born around 1595 in Wädenswil, Switzerland. Records show that he was an Anabaptist in 1622. This was also the year his first wife, Barbara Strahler, died, leaving Peter to care for a 1- and 3-year-old child. 11 years later, in 1633, at the age of 38, Peter lived with his second wife, Anna Pfister, and their 3 surviving sons on a farm in the small hamlet of Spitzen of the nearby parish of Hirzel. Their 3 sons were ages 2, 3, and 6 years old at the time. Anna Pfister, 1 year older than Peter, was born in Stocking, a short distance away from Spitzen, and had married Peter 10 years earlier in 1623. Tragically, premature mortality seemed to have been most common, especially in very young children. For it was only 4 years earlier in 1629 that Peter and Anna experienced the loss of a young son and daughter to pestilence. 4 years before 1629 and 4 years after, they also lost the children from Peter's first marriage due to unknown causes. I'm about to show you some photographs of Spitzen and surrounding countryside with Hirzel in the distance. Peter was a well-known Anabaptist preacher whose congregation would often meet in his house. He would also represent Anabaptists in the area at large. There's documentation from late in the year 1635 that reads, having failed to achieve the state church's goal of reverting the Anabaptists to the state Reformed Church, the authorities in Zurich then asked the Anabaptists to reply in writing if they were ready to recant or if they would immigrate. Peter Brubacher sent a response back from Waddensville, which contained 9 signatures and in brackets and many others, stating they were not willing to recant, nor did they want to immigrate. Understand, to immigrate anywhere at that time would have been most difficult, if not dangerous, for the neighboring countries to the north and west had been battling for 17 years in what was to become known as the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was fought primarily between Catholic and Protestant factions in a battle to determine which religion would control various parts of Europe. The sides would adjust to become much more political as the years went by. The war would prove to be one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. Entire regions were destroyed, devastated, and laid barren. Governments were bankrupted, and possibly up to a third of the population was killed. Through it all, Switzerland would manage to remain neutral, partly because of all the major powers in Europe depended on the Swiss mercenary soldiers. For close to a century, since the beginning and threat of the Anabaptist movement, the Reformed Church would clash with the Anabaptists and respond with harsh persecution, torture, and even execution. The Reformed Church pressured the Zurich City Council to enact legislation to suppress the Anabaptist movement. Fines were levied, which eventually escalated to arrests, imprisonment, branding, banishment, and finally the City Council passed an edict which established the death penalty by drowning for participating in the Anabaptist movement, not to be repealed until 1639. Because of his Anabaptist beliefs and defiance to the church authorities, Peter at age 42 would ultimately be taken and imprisoned in a place called Jurtenbach in May of 1637, where he would remain for over 40 weeks. He and many others were fed miserably, endured much suffering, and would often fall victim to other prisoners confined there for far worse deeds and evil crimes. After his release in 1638, some say he escaped, the authorities would often send officers out to search for Peter's whereabouts, but Peter would remain elusive, nowhere to be found. A year later, in the spring of 1639, and in his absence, his wife, Anna Pfister, died, leaving their sons essentially orphans. To digress a little bit, in the book Apart from the World by J. Ross Bauman, there was a bit of information, not more than a sentence actually, that piqued my interest. It read, a mile northwest of the old castle lived Peter Brubacher of Waddensville. The short passage continued on to mention Peter's sons, along with other information that we will get to shortly. Dwelling on this bit of information, last September, my wife and I traveled to Germany, adding in a short visit to Switzerland. There we visited what I determined to be the old castle, located in close proximity to Wädenswil and Spitzen. At the entrance to the ruins, an interpretive sign unit read, Old Wädenswil Castle, located on the parish of Richterswil. It's one of the most impressive ruins in the canton of Zurich. The barons of Wädenswil erected the oldest building before the year 1200 with the residential tower. Later, larger parts of the castle were built under the order of St. John in the 15th century. I found it quite stirring to think that we were wandering about the castle ruins and viewing out into the distant countryside from the same ground and vantage points Peter must have experienced 400 years ago. To continue with Peter. From research cited by Jane Evans Best, after the death of their mother, Anna Pfister, the sons, whose ages were between 9 and 13 years old, stayed on the farm in Spitzen and attended, most notably, the state church services. Peter's possessions were worth nearly 10,000 guilders and were confiscated on May 6, 1640, and the children were brought to Zurich, also to the Jurtenbach, where orphans were educated. All expenses for them paid from the confiscated fortune. Note that during the medieval period, Jurtenbach was a former Dominican cloister, surrounded by the Limmat River. The cloister had been dissolved at the beginning of the Reformation in Zurich, after which the city government took over the monastic buildings. The ground floor of the north wing was used as an orphanage, and between 1637 and 1639, a prison was set up in the west wing, the former dormitories of the nuns. This just happened to be the time period when Peter was imprisoned there. For about 2 years, the three sons were housed and educated at Jurtenbach, after which they would continue on and finish apprenticeships in various trades. The sons' names, Hans Heinrich, Peter, and Hans Jacob. I'm about to show you some historic maps and photographs taken over the years of the location and remaining footprint of Jurtenbach. On this map, dated 1894, we see the silhouettes of the former Dominican cloister and orphanage, identified as numbers 2 and 3. Here in a sepia tone photograph taken in the year 1900 of Zurich, the Limmat River, and the location of the former cloister buildings. In a silver print taken in 1909 that shows the absence of the former cloister building, also identified here as number 2, and the presence of the former orphanage building identified as number 3. This in keeping with the numbering used on the previous images I just showed you. This is a current street view image of the headquarters for the Zurich City Police, once the former orphanage of Yurtenbach. The building is also referred to as Waisenhaus, which means orphanage. And here we see a similar aerial view with the former locations of the cloister and prison ghosted in. The current police headquarters building and former orphanage are circled to the right. It is interesting that just downstream on the Limmat River from the former Yurtenbach is the site where Felix Manz and other martyrs were executed by drowning. A plaque has been mounted in their memory. It reads, "Here in the middle of the river Limmat, from a fishing platform were drowned Felix Manz and 5 other Anabaptists during the Reformation of 1527 to 1532. Hans Landis, the last Anabaptist, was executed in Zurich during 1614. Now getting back to Hans Heinrich, Peter, and Hans Jacob. The sons were most assuredly aware and knew the whereabouts of their father, who, a fugitive, fled to Alsace. The sons would join him in 1651, the year that all expenses paid to them from their inheritance came to an end. Apparently, Peter had been living in Alsace by 1648, the year the 30 Years' War came to an end. Peter purchased land in the general vicinity of what is Ribeauvillé today. Peter would live in this area from 1648 to 1661. Ribeauvillé is one of the oldest medieval towns in Alsace, consisting of half-timbered houses, many dating from the 16th century. The 3 castles dominating the hilltops were built by the powerful Ribeaupierre family in the 11th to 13th century. The castles fell into disuse in the 16th and 17th centuries, right around the time that Peter and his sons lived in the area. And here's some photos of Ribeauvillé. On a later note, I forgot to mention that Ribeauvillé is known for being the town of storks. I was extremely lucky to be in the right place at the right time to witness a stork that had just delivered a baby. I thought I would get your attention. Apparently, there are church records in Hirzel documenting that Peter's eldest son, Hans Heinrich, with his wife and 2 children, lived in the village of Mackenheim, not far from the Rhine River. It is quite likely that Peter and his sons lived in close proximity to one another, if not on the same farmland. And now a few photographs taken of what continues to be a small village of Mackenheim. When the first Swiss-German Anabaptists immigrated to the Palatinate region of Germany, huge areas on both sides of the Rhine River had been depopulated and destroyed because of the 30 Years' War. The Swiss Anabaptists, who had been forced to leave their homeland because of their religious faith, were invited to settle in the area, but with limited religious freedom, to restore and refurbish the land and villages. In 1661, Peter, with his third wife, Margrethe Strickler, and his sons, Hans Heinrich and Hans Jacob, and their families, relocated from Alsace to live on a farm 2 hours from Worms, in the Palatinate region of Germany. Called Ebersheim today, the farm was formerly called Ebersheimerhof, Hof meaning farm. There doesn't seem to be any records as to what happened to the middle son, Peter. It is thought that he might have died in Alsace with no wife or children. Peter the father, along with other Swiss Anabaptists in the farm community, also then known as Mennonites, had a special arrangement with the electorate of the Palatinate and leased the farmland for 12 years. The arrangement would be unique for those only in Ebersheim. In 1664, a concession was decreed by the elector, known as the Edict of Toleration, which applied to all the Palatinate Mennonites in the area. An elector, by the way, is perhaps comparable to a state governor or provincial premier. One condition of the edict was that they could only hold worship services in villages of 5 or more households, and that no more than 20 households could be together at one time. Other conditions were that they were to refrain from any rebaptizing, and each family was required to pay an annual protection fee of 6 gulden. In order to control these payments, all Mennonites were required to register at irregular intervals with the government. As a result, today we have terrific documentation of our ancestors based on these census reports conducted from 1664 to 1793. In the spring of 2018, during the same time period that I was having email exchanges with Rolf Pfister, as you know, Rolf played a lead role in my presentation this morning. Rolf, knowing of my interest in my ancestors who relocated to Ebersheim, directed me to an online blog post that focused on Ebersheimerhof in the Rhineland-Palatinate. I would take this blog post that was written in German, as indicated in black, translated into English as indicated in blue, and highlight the names having family significance in red. Most curious, while browsing through this blog post, I came across a series of lists containing families in the Ebersheimerhof that identified the full name of the head of household only, followed by a wife, son, and daughters, all identified simply by number counts, a 0 indicating none. I would take on the challenge and continue to do so, I might add, and attempt to uncover the names of some of the wives identified as only a number. Some indeed would turn out to be a Brubaker. I found it remarkable that I was able to identify Peter, Hans Heinrich, and Hans Jacob, listed as early residents and part of the original 10 families that signed the 12-year lease for the farm in Ebersheimerhof. The blog post included other lists recorded at later dates that showed evidence of the next generation of Brubakers coming of age, of the sons no longer represented as simply a number. At first, I couldn't place the significance of the names, but soon realized that one name in particular was Abraham, father of D2 Abraham, who would one day come to America. And most interesting, listed next to Abraham was apparently a younger brother, Hans Jacob, unknown to exist until now, at least to me. Take note of the misspelling of the surnames recorded as Brubacher. As an aside, it is important to know that the older brother of Abraham and Hans Jacob was Hans Brubaker, who came to America in 1717. I mentioned him at the beginning of this presentation. Coming across these lists, the blog posts at that time was a revelation to me. It wouldn't be until several years later, while performing more research, that I would learn and realize that these reference lists on the blog post coincided with the registered census reports mentioned earlier. The census was required not just of the community of Ebersheimerhof, but of all the Mennonite communities throughout the Palatinate. Shown here is a document I put together based on the census reports that indicates the presence of Brubakers listed during different census years. Take note of the head of household, followed by numbers indicating whether he had a wife, sons, daughters, farmhands, and housemaids. Peter, Hans Heinrich, and Hans Jacob are not present in these reports. It is thought that Peter died in 1668, his son Hans Heinrich in 1685. What happened to Peter's son, Hans Jacob, and his family is not known. And another bit of ancestral interest is that the brothers, Hans, Abraham, and Hans Jacob, are grandsons of the son Hans Heinrich and great-grandsons of Peter. Once again, a great stroke of luck, I was able to contact the author of the blog post, Gudrun Harold, with whom I would, as with Rolf, have many email exchanges during the course of the next couple months. Unfamiliar with the person's name, initially I wasn't sure if I was communicating with a man or woman. As it turns out, Gudrun is a widow, the same age as myself, who lives in Wiesbaden, just outside of Mainz, Germany. As with my correspondence with Rolf, I would communicate with Gudrun, translating my emails from English to German. Excuse me. Together, Gudrun and I would decipher, question, and fill in numerous gaps and puzzle pieces of the Brubacher ancestry. As I mentioned earlier, my wife and I were fortunate to travel to Germany last September, where we would meet Gudrun and together take a day trip to Ebersheim. She was a joy and a hoot to meet and be with. Here are a few maps to help you become better familiar with where the Rhineland-Palatinate region and the village of Ebersheim are located in the scheme of things. And let's not overlook the presence of the Rhine River flowing close by. This photograph taken just upstream of Ebersheim. I'm about to show you some photographs taken from that day trip with Gudrun and subsequent ones to Ebersheim. So sit back and enjoy. Earlier, I mentioned the Edict of Toleration, that spelled out conditions the Palatina Mennonites were required to follow. In 1744, the Edict of Toleration was renewed to limit the number of Mennonite families permitted to live in the area to a maximum of 200 families. As a result, many young married families were forced to leave. Some simply moved to a neighboring village if it belonged to another sovereign. However, many others had no other alternative than to go by horse and wagon to far-off land destinations. The country most appealing at the time was Galicia, a historic and geographic region spanning what is now southeastern Poland and western Ukraine. The other option was to go by boat down the Rhine River to Rotterdam, to then embark on a most treacherous voyage to America. The Rhine River has played an important and key role to our ancestral story. It seemed to be always flowing close by, influencing where our ancestors would settle to and move on to. My wife and I would spend a leisurely day, beginning from the river port town of Bachara, taking in some stops along the way, ending the day in Koblenz. Here are some travel photographs taken from a ferry boat cruise along one of the most picturesque sections of the Rhine River. Dotted with castles and fortresses on hilltops, some dating before our ancestors would journey down the Rhine River to Rotterdam before their voyage to North America. This brings this presentation. Oh, 1 second. The journey down the Rhine River left a lasting impression on me, providing numerous moments to be transported back in time, to view some of the same castles, landmarks, waters, and terrain as viewed through the eyes of our ancestors centuries ago. This brings this presentation, this journey to an end. If you have any comments and would like to get in touch with me, I have left a notebook with a black cover up front or in the back for you to do so. Also, I have provided some printed handouts of some genealogy charting that recaps the ancestors I have touched upon this afternoon and their offspring, identifying from whom the beginnings of our alphabet coded family lines begin. And yes, also, I've left a small bottle of water from our namesake brook, the Brubacher, as well. I regret not having to be here in person due to COVID. I hope you enjoy the rest of the reunion. Thank you.